Thank you for tuning in to Trending with the Tribune. I'm your host, Kaliss Stephens, and today we're going to talk with Reverend Sanders, Senior Servant of the Metropolitan Interdenominational Church. We will discuss the role that he plays in the HIV and AIDS community. How are you doing today, Reverend Sanders?
Very good. It's a great day.
Good. So today we're going to talk about your involvement with the AIDS and HIV community. Can you just give me a brief explanation of what you do with that?
Sure. Well, there are many levels upon which I'm involved in it, but for all intents and purposes, at the heart of it is trying to develop the ways in which the faith community is developing an effective response to HIV and AIDS. I do that on all levels, the level of education, prevention, providing direct services, and also biomedical research and clinical work as well. So I kind of do it on all levels. It didn't start that way. It started primarily as us being involved in trying to do education and prevention initiatives within our community. Metropolitan Church was founded on February the 1st, 1981, but HIV/AIDS, as we know it, was first identified on June the 5th, 1981. So I always feel like we were born as a congregation, for the place where a response to this disease would come. We were not instantly aware in 1981 that HIV was going to be at the center of our work, but within 2.5 years, it became crystal clear when the first person to die in the history of Metropolitan Church. We actually went for 2.5 years with no deaths. And then the first person to die was one of the founding members. And he died from a strange disease that did not make sense to us. When we were perplexed, when people told us that he had somehow come to be affected by toxoplasmosis, which is one of the opportunistic diseases that people very often would die from at that point in history if they contracted it, just like pneumocystis pneumonia. If you got pneumonia, it was pretty much understood. As a matter of fact, in many instances, when they first identified HIV, especially in San Francisco, those who were doing the research referred to it as a strange form of pneumonia that they were seeing, to come. And then, of course, it became more clearly identified also with being a kind of cancer. But in the final analysis, what was discovered over time was that even though there might be some similarities to the ways in which those diseases are akin to HIV, but the fact is, over time we've come to realize that it is really a unique reflection of a way in which the immune system can be systematically deteriorated and creating vulnerability to opportunistic diseases. So that's kind of the way in which we got to it and started. But once we started, we realized that it was not a disease that could be pigeonholed in terms of being looked at as being what was then referred to as a gay white male disease, because indeed the founding member of our congregation who died was not a gay white male. And at that point we realized that a lot of what seemingly were correlating factors for people who were, the person side. I don't like to say the term victims, but he ended up being infected. There's a way in which we realized there were similar characteristics that probably would lead to the African American community being particularly susceptible, because it does end up being driven by issues like poverty. It ends up being driven by issues that have to do with sometimes education and housing, especially the configurations that housing can sometimes take, which will translate into what's considered social stratification. And when you get social stratification, there's a way in which the likelihood for disease being heightened within those communities is greater, no matter who you are. So, that's it.
So when did you become so strong about the topic? Like, was it when you first found out in the past that the disease was present, or was it recently? Like, when did it become a strong topic for you?
Well, actually, it started for us 33 years ago. We're a 36-year-old congregation. But 33 years ago was when one of our founding members died. And I think we came to the issue the way many people do, because in many instances, it's for altruistic reasons that people end up gravitating towards their concern for the disease. It's when a loved one, a family member, a colleague, a friend, a neighbor, someone that you're close to, and then all of a sudden you probably get to be more concerned. I mean, that's not only peculiar to HIV and AIDS, but most of us sometimes come to have new levels of awareness about a disease or an issue as it comes to impact us directly. And it came to impact us directly. I mean, this was the first person to die, but he also was a person who was a founding member. So at that point, we started looking into it. And the more we looked into it, the more we realized that there were things that we could do in our community that would help to stem the threat of exposure. And we decided then to begin to do education. And then after we did education issues a while, we would begin to do prevention. And after we did prevention for a while, we had to add on to that providing some direct services, because we realized that the disease is one that was so stigmatized in terms of the ways in which people had fear and reluctance in terms of wanting to deal with it, to acknowledge it. We realized there were people who ended up with a lot of very basic fundamental needs that were not being met. So we started trying to be the place where those kinds of issues and those kinds of needs could be met. So we worked at it, and eventually we were doing those two things. But it didn't take us long before we realized that people also needed psychosocial services. We even started to realize that people needed safe spaces. So that's when we decided we needed to develop what we refer to as the First Response Center. And the First Response Center was the place where we really carry out the activity of our ministries in this regard on an everyday basis. It particularly ends up being a place where people who in one way or another find themselves being disenfranchised, or disinherited, or some otherwise being discounted, or kind of dismissed within their family, within their community because of this disease. Unfortunately, initially people thought of the disease primarily as a disease that was being contracted by people as a result of their sexual behavior, people that were dealing with drugs, or people that were involved in commercial sex work. And there's a way in which most of the ways in which the disease were characterized in terms of transmission were things that were generally thought of as being very negative. We now know that is a part of what might be an issue, but it's not in any sense its totality. Because especially when you realize how many instances of heterosexual transmission there end up being in our society and in the world, it's clear that there is a disproportionate impact on same-gender loving men, particularly. But the fact is that it's a much bigger issue than that. And we decided early on to decide, really as a congregation, that we would make it a part of our statement in terms of discipleship and our faithfulness to our walk and following, Jesus Christ, who is at the center of our faith tradition. Jesus' work was built around caring for those who were, those who were left out, the least and the lost. I mean, he was about the business of addressing those that society would shun and treat as though they were nobody and worthless and of no significance. If we're faithful to the teachings of Jesus, there's a way in which all of us in our churches ought to be tuned in to those kinds of issues and addressing those kinds of situations. So we took that as a mandate and a part of our calling as a congregation.
I like how you kind of mentioned that it was, it's not just a disease that happens amongst gay people. It's a disease that can happen amongst all people.
Oh, yes.
So that brings me to that question of what specific people do you target when you speak out about the disease?
Yeah. Well, there was a time when people used to talk and refer to what was called at-risk populations. We now talk about it in terms of all populations being at risk, because there's a way in which if indeed you have any kind of experience that involves sexual intimacy, your vulnerability ends up being a part of what you're dealing with. So in that instance, whether it's heterosexual or whether it's, as people refer, homosexual, it's bisexual, trans, whatever might be the definition in terms of sexual orientation. There's a way in which you find yourself realizing that's, but that's not true. One of the ways in which one of the great scholars I know refers to the experience of life in terms of things you can be sure people are going to do. He said you can be sure all people are going to drink water, they're going to eat food, and they're going to have sex. Now when you think about it, some of the greatest vulnerabilities that we have in our world as far as disease can be tracked and attributed to those things. I mean, one of the greatest issues in the world is the lack of potable and fresh, water for people to be able to drink. So even in places in the world where you might have medications that people could take that could make a difference, they don't have fresh water, they don't have clean water to take it with. And it's, of course, many of the diseases that we know that have global impact are driven by not having clean water. The same thing ends up being true in terms of food, but there are ways in which people who are in various environments where there's famine, or where there's a lack of access to quality food or healthy food, or safe food, just because of the ways in which there's the inability to be able to preserve or to be able to refrigerate or whatever it might be. So there's a way in which the susceptibility to disease ends up being greatly attributed to the ways in which people deal with water, food, and then sex. So I think my friend was right when he said that that's something all people are going to do. It tends to be a topic, though, that we don't deal with very forthrightly, that we don't address openly, especially within the church. And one of the things that we try to do is to make it clear that there's no way you can talk about the faith tradition that we're a part of. I really think I could argue it in terms of any faith tradition where perhaps the issue of sexuality should not be spoken to, because invariably the people that we serve are people that will have this as one of the issues of their life.
And I heard that you mentioned the church. Are church goers, are they sensitive to the subject of HIV and AIDS?
It's better than it's been, I'll put it like that. There was a point at which there was reluctance. The church early on probably played a less than positive role in terms of the response to the disease, because many chose to be judgmental and fearful of those who were identified with the disease, especially in terms of same-gender loving behavior. But I think over time what we've seen is that there's a change in level of consciousness. It's not just about being politically correct, it's about being spiritually and theologically correct and understanding what it means to love unconditionally and to be willing to respond to the needs of those who might find themselves in life-threatening or dehumanizing or hurtful environments. So over time, this began to change. But let me tell you some of the kinds of things that have helped that change. One is to be able to help people to understand the many different ways in which they can be involved in helping to respond to the disease. There are ways in which people who might still be homophobic, and there might still be some people who are sexist, and you cannot deal with the issue also without dealing with the realities of how racism plays into it. Those things might still be a part of the reality for some who end up now at least being willing to deal peripherally, if not in depth, with some of the ways in which the disease manifests itself. For instance, we've had partners to work with us who are very much not in tune with the idea of being affirming and supporting and celebratory of same-gender loving people, but they can deal with the fact of people who are dealing with sickness and disease. So we've been able to get folks who will help us in terms of maybe even lending their church van to help drive people to their appointments, or to lend some support to people who might have needs in terms of basic necessities of life. So I tell people that HIV/AIDS really impacts every dimension of human life. So if your issue is housing, then we know that HIV/AIDS is one issue where indeed housing ends up being an important part of how you have to effectively respond. If it ends up being, having significant, adequate health care, opportunities for health care, it's one of the issues. and any ways in which you can participate end up being important. Early on in the disease, it was a death sentence, and people were dying. If you were determined to be, infected with HIV and AIDS, it was kind of understood. It was a matter of time. It wasn't always the same time, but for many people, especially if they were diagnosed late, and in many instances, people who were afraid and people, who were dealing with guilt and shame in a way that made them reluctant to own up to what was going on. It meant that the progression of the disease had come to a point that very often when you found out that, they were infected, they were at the point where their immune systems were so compromised they were near death. But the church was very interesting then, because churches every day deal with issues of grief and bereavement. So grief ministries and bereavement ministries and that kind of thing ended up being a part of how the church would respond. Then there was denial very often in terms of why a person had died. And in many instances, families would go along with that because they did not want people to think that somehow, their son, their daughter, their loved one died from some behavior that was outside of the realm of moral and ethical acceptability and that kind of thing. I think now people understand that that's not the case but it's also a disease now. The big difference is that since the mid-1990s, since 96, 97, since the development of the retroviral drugs, AIDS has increasingly become what we refer to as a chronic progressive disease over against a death sentence. So with the new categories of drugs that we have, there's a way in which people can live with the disease.